Okay, so welcome everyone. Today is day 4 of the Wharton Annual Analytics Conference. Today we have 2 technical workshops for you to attend. This morning's workshop is brought to you by the Penn Wharton budget model, and the topic is, what do we know and do we actually know it using federal economic data for policy analysis? This workshop will be led by Richard Prisinzano, Director of Policy Analysis, and Alex Arnon, Associate Director of Policy Analysis at Penn Wharton Budget Model. Just a couple of reminders before we begin. This session is scheduled to run until 11:30 a.m. and it's going to be interactive. So if you feel comfortable, go ahead and turn on your camera. You can also submit any questions via the chat function throughout the session. I'm going to be monitoring chat, and then I'll have Rich and Alex answer your questions as they go. So feel free to use that chat function. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Rich.
Hey, thanks very much, Lauren. Yeah, thanks for coming. We're looking forward to this. I think we enjoy doing this stuff. So what I kind of want to start with, just to give you an idea of what we do, if you're unfamiliar with it. So like Lauren said, we're the Penn Wharton budget model. And what we are is a public policy think tank that is associated with Wharton, and we look at all sorts of different policies. So I think our bread and butter is sort of tax policy changes. So that's a lot of what we do. So if the recent proposals by Biden have tax changes in it, we analyze those things. We put on what's called a budget score. So, what would the proposal raise in revenue or lose in revenue? And then we take those changes and we put it through a macro model that gives us a projection of changes in GDP, capital investment, labor, those sorts of things. And so what we're going to talk about today is kind of all the, I should say a subset of the data that we use to do these projections, how we've incorporated them, how we interpret the data, some of the difficulties with interpreting the data, and then we'll kind of end with an example of how we think about things and why we come up with some of the projections we do, and again we encourage you to ask questions as we go. I think it makes it more fun for us, and I think a little bit better if we get questions. So looking forward to those things as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who's going to drive the slideshow here and do most of the talking here at the beginning. Alex.
All right, thank you, Rich. Okay, so today we're going to talk about sort of 3 connected but semi-distinct things. First part is going to be about headline economic indicators, and in particular headline labor market indicators. So these are sort of the main economic statistics you hear about, and really what I'm hoping to do here is give you a sense of where are these numbers actually coming from, what do they mean, and how do we think about them and use them in our policy work. The second part is going to be looking at sort of new approaches to tracking the economy in real time. So this is going beyond the headline statistics you typically see, and talk about some of the new data sources that have become available really since 2020, and then how we've used them, and a particular technique that we've used to sort of overcome some of the shortcomings of these new data sources. And then finally, I'll turn it back to Rich to talk about, the tangible examples of how this all comes together into estimating the effects of tax policy changes, and in particular, sort of the role of behavior there and how that makes it very difficult to come up with estimates of these things. So first off, the headline economic indicators. So really what I'm talking about here is the jobs report. So this is the monthly jobs report, which itself contains 2 numbers, which are the non-farm payroll employment level or change, and then the unemployment rate. And then the second common statistic you'll see is gross domestic product, which is sort of the summary measure of the whole economy. And this is not actually why they are called headline indicators, but these are typically the statistics that make the big banner headlines. Usually when things are going bad is when you'll see them. Now, in the interest of time, probably not going to get to GDP, which is just a huge topic, but if there is time at the end or questions about it, we can come back to that. So mostly I'm going to be talking about the jobs report here. Okay, so before we get into that, first, just a high-level overview of where does federal economic data come from. So obviously, the starting point for these numbers, and this applies to really the vast number. There's a vast number of economic statistics prepared and published by the federal government. But really, unless you're some kind of specialist, you're probably only going to be looking at these headline numbers. But in all cases, we obviously start with measurement. So we need to track what is actually going on in the economy. And usually what that means is for the first releases, the first time the government puts out a number, say for here's the employment rate for April, that's going to be coming from a mix of survey data and projections and models produced by federal statistical agencies. And then over time, we get better and better information, more detailed surveys, all kinds of data comes in and becomes available, so they'll improve the estimates over time. So measurement is the first step. Now, measurement is not really enough because you first have to figure out what it is you're actually trying to measure. And often we find that the thing we really care about is not measurable. We just can't come up with a way to actually detect it. And it might not even really be a concept, really a sound, a concrete concept that we can actually define and measure. And so, I mean, this is a little bit silly, but as we'll see, things can get a little metaphysical when you're talking about economic statistics. This is mostly true with GDP, but also we'll encounter a little bit of it talking about the jobs report. And the third big piece of these economic statistics is the bureaucratic process that the federal statistical agencies have. And typically, we think bureaucracy, that's a bad thing, but in economic statistics, it is often said that the U.S. has, our economic statistics are the envy of the world. And a lot of that does have to do with just the amount of effort into measurement, but probably the single biggest factor is the quality of the individuals doing this work at our statistical agencies who really set the standard for most of the world. And this is just inevitably going to be part of the process because measurement is imperfect. There are some philosophical questions that don't have obvious right or wrong answers, and ultimately someone has to fill in the gaps there and make decisions about what we actually want to see in those final numbers. So diving into the monthly jobs report. So this is a report prepared monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It comes out on the first Friday of a new month. So, we'll get tomorrow actually is a big jobs day coming. That'll be for the previous month. We'll get jobs numbers for April tomorrow. And this is not so important, but the jobs report is really trying to give you a snapshot of what was going on roughly in the middle of the month. So this will either be the pay period or the week that includes the 12th day of the month. So it's not an average for the full month, which is often how we think about it. It's really what was going on in the middle of the month. Usually this doesn't matter at all, but if you so happen to be in the middle of an all-time historic epic collapse in, say, mid-March 2020, it can actually make a big difference for those, comparing March and April economic statistics. So here's an example of what this actually looks like. Here's a little quote from the Wall Street Journal. And just here, I just want to highlight that, there are two distinct numbers that come out in this report. There is, first, you would typically see something like employers added X number of jobs last month. And what that's referring to is what's called the change in non-farm payroll employment. And then the second number you see is the unemployment rate. And so we're going to talk about each of those in turn. So starting off with non-farm payroll employment, what do we mean by this? Non-farm payroll employment is just the number of people who worked or received pay at a non-farm business or civilian government agency. So first thing to note is we're talking about non-farm business, civilian government agencies. That's a lot of people who are not included there. So farm workers, obviously not at non-farm businesses. Self-employed workers are, they are not working or receiving pay for a business. They themselves are just, essentially a one-person business. There are some exceptions, depending on how you've organized the business you own, you might actually technically be an employee of yourself. And in that case, you would show up in this number. But most of the self-employed are just not counted in this measure. Household employees and unpaid family workers, so this would be like somebody helping out on a family farm, they won't be captured here. The military, obviously not civilian. Intelligence agencies are also not included. It's not a big population. I mention it mostly because I like the idea that at some point in the past, somebody from the Bureau of Labor Statistics called up the CIA and asked them, could you please tell us about everyone who works for you? And they got a no. Okay, so here's what that number actually looks like over history. And the first thing you'll notice is that this chart is completely useless. No thanks to 2020. This was once a very standard thing to look at, but now we can't really use this chart again or anymore. So what we're going to do is take 2020 and beyond and put it off to the side where it can't bother the other years. And here we go. So the main thing to notice here is, what I've plotted here is first in the lighter blue, this is the actual number, the change from month to month in non-farm payroll employment that is reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then on top of that, the darker solid line is the 3-month moving average. And what you'll notice is that that lighter blue line is bouncing around like crazy. It's very, very noisy. And so, because you don't want to look at one of those dips down that immediately bounce back and say, that things are going terribly because it's just noise. What you typically want to be doing with this, and what you'll often see, is we look at the moving 3-month average. So, we get a new jobs number and we update our estimate for the past 3 months. And that is what we sort of say is going on right now. And that's just to avoid getting misled by the noise that you see there. All right. So where did this number actually come from? The source of the non-farm payroll employment number is a survey of businesses. It's typically referred to as the establishment survey or the payroll survey. And this is an amazing survey there are very few surveys that are as good at getting at the underlying population that they're trying to capture. So every month, the Bureau surveys 145,000 non-farm businesses. This covers 700,000 work sites out of the total 10 million or so that we have in the US, which is very good coverage. And then because they typically, they're going to be surveying a lot of the larger employers who account for a disproportionate share of the employment, the direct survey actually captures 31% of the population we're trying to target. So that is just incredibly good survey coverage compared to most of what you'll see in any kind of survey, really. So this is a very high quality measure. It's very good at getting at what's going on with the underlying population. But 31% is not 100%. And obviously we want numbers that capture the entirety of the economy. So what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does is they weight the survey results up to a national level estimate. And this is a very common technique in surveying. Became sort of a big controversy briefly in political surveys because the techniques that you use to weight a survey up to the population can have a big effect on the results. But the Bureau is typically much better at this than political pollsters are. But so what this means basically is that we are surveying businesses by state, by the industry, and then how big they are. So let's say we have a business in California. It's a manufacturing business and they have 100 to 250 employees. And so we get information about that. How many people did they hire or how many people did they lay off in any given month? And then what the Bureau is going to do is going to say, okay, this business is representative of all manufacturing businesses in California with 100 to 250 employees. So, let's say we've surveyed one of those businesses and we know that there are 5 of them in the total population. We're just going to weight the results from that one business up 5 times to capture the full population that is being represented by this one business that we actually surveyed. Now, one problem with a survey like this is that the underlying population that you're trying to capture is actually changing over time. And it's just impossible to keep your survey methodology up with that. It can take up to a year or two for a new business to show up in the information that we have to design a survey. So it's just not possible to update the sample in real time. And what that means is that in order to produce a full population estimate, the Bureau has to sort of model how many businesses are going out of business and disappearing from the population each month, and how many new businesses are starting up and entering the population of interest. And so the Bureau is going to be trying to predict that from month to month. They are historically very good at this because they have a lot of information to work with. Again, this is the sort of thing that might break down in the midst of an all-time economic collapse where businesses are closing right and left. We're in circumstances that we've never encountered before. What a business closure even means isn't clear anymore. And so what all that means is that, like both the survey itself and the modeling that helps them get from the survey to the population, it becomes much dicier and much more uncertain when you're in the midst of a crisis. And probably that has never, ever been true nearly as much as it was true in 2020. So one issue with using this number, every month we get a number like the economy added 266,000 jobs. But that number in itself doesn't really tell you that much. What does 266,000 jobs mean for the economy is going to be very context dependent. And so a little anecdote just to illustrate this point. The November 2019 jobs report, we found out that the economy had added 266,000 jobs. And that was considered to be fantastic news. The labor market was stronger than we thought. That was higher than people were expecting. It showed that there was a lot of underlying momentum in the economy. It was a very positive reception to that number. 1 year later, we got a very similar number, 245,000. If you remember how much those lines were bouncing around, the difference between these two numbers is insignificant. But in November 2020, 245,000 was a total disaster because we were just coming off the biggest loss of employment in recorded history, or at least since we started keeping these statistics. And we were hoping for a bounce back that would sort of match the magnitude of that collapse, and 245,000 just wasn't going to cut it. This was very bad news for the economy. And this applies more generally over the long term in that how many jobs we want to be adding each month is going to depend on the underlying demographic situation in the US. So how quickly is the working age population going to grow? And that actually can vary pretty significantly, across decades. And so, for instance, probably through most of the 2000s, we thought something like 250,000 jobs a month was what we needed in order to keep the economy to keep the labor market going strong. But as we look ahead to a couple of decades where the working age population is going to be growing much more slowly, we're probably going to expect to see something like 100 to 150,000, and that will be perfectly satisfactory in order to keep up with the demographic growth. So this is all just to say, you can't interpret these numbers in a vacuum. You sort of need to know the context, both long-term and short-term. Another issue with the non-farm payroll employment numbers is that they get revised. Like I said, the Bureau gets, our agencies get better information over time, and they will incorporate that information into their estimates. And they will go back in history and update what we thought happened to what we now think happened. And here what is showing is, they do two revisions. So we get the first number, that's the one you'll always see talked about. And then the next month, they'll go back and revise it once. And then 2 months after, they'll go back and revise it again. And that'll be sort of the final estimate. So here, what I plotted is the difference between the third final estimate and the first estimate, the one that we actually talk about, as a percent of that first estimate. So this is basically how wrong was the report when we first got the number. And again, that first number is really the only one that most people will ever see. And you can see that in most months, the revisions are pretty small. And basically that first number you get is giving you a pretty good idea of where BLS will eventually end up. But there are months when the revisions can be very, very significant. And upwards of 200% has happened. This is just a few years. If you go back to the financial crisis, these revisions, there were very large revisions that had a really significant effect just because we misunderstood what was happening at the moment that policymakers were making critical decisions. So in addition to the fact that the data is very noisy, that first estimate you're going to see, we don't have a ton of confidence that it's going to stay where it is. You know, it might move around over time as the Bureau gets better information. And then one last thing to talk about before we move on to the unemployment rate. So here, this is the same chart I showed you above without 2020, and this is just the actual number. And you know, I've been telling you this number comes from a survey conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This number is not at all what the survey shows. What the survey actually shows looks like this, that those really volatile lines bouncing around, that is what the actual employment situation looks like. And what's going on here basically is that, for instance, every December, there's a massive labor market boom. And then every January, there's a huge labor market recession. And this is just the normal pattern of seasonal hiring. So we see this, but we don't really care about it. You know, it's not a bad thing. It's not a issue for policymakers to address, the fact that there's a surge of hiring around the holidays, and then those people all lose their jobs. Or for instance, there's a big collapse in employment every summer as the school year ends and teachers stop working. These are not, you know, this is not a labor market problem to address. It's just part of the natural cycle of the economy. So what the Bureau of Labor Statistics will do is they will seasonally adjust the data. And this is almost any economic statistics you see are going to be seasonally adjusted. They usually are not as extensive. You know, they usually don't change the picture quite as dramatically as with this number. And, you know, again, this is something that usually works very well. The Bureau and a lot of economists spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff and generally do a pretty good job of it. It does become a lot dicier in the midst of a crisis where we're seeing the kind of movements that we have not seen before. And this has been an issue that the Bureau has faced in the last year with the numbers, and they've, you know, adjusted how they're doing the adjustments to respond to that. So in general, this is not something you actually really need to think about. There's nothing we can do. They're doing their best and are doing a very good job. But it's just important to keep in mind that what's actually happening is quite a bit different than the numbers that we see in the headlines.
Alex, quick question and comment from the audience from Ron. So he said Nonfarm is U3, so many different numbers for unemployment.
So as we will discuss in just a second, the non-farm payroll employment numbers and unemployment numbers like U3, these are entirely independent sources. So we will talk about U3 in just a moment after this slide. So yes, so to sort of sum up the pros and cons of using non-farm payroll employment as your indicator, the big pro is that it's really easy to understand what this means. It's the number of people who are working. That's a very useful thing to know. And it's easy, and you know, there's not much ambiguity there. Once you've narrowed your mind to this is the population we're talking about, this is just trying to be a count of how many people are working. And the survey is huge. So compared to most of the surveys that you might see out there, it's just got a very strong coverage of the population of interest, which makes it a very useful number. Now, the downsides are, as you mentioned, there's a lot of workers who are just not included in this measure. Typically, you know, if you're looking at changes or you're trying to look at trends, that's not going to matter too much because these things are correlated. But if you're looking over the long term, then, for instance, changes in the share of the population who are self-employed can be pretty dramatic over a span of decades. Then, as I mentioned, you really do need context to say, is this a good number or a bad number? The number in itself doesn't tell you that much. And then finally, even though it is a big survey, the economy is just inherently noisy. There's a lot of complicated stuff going on. And sometimes, you know, you'll see a big dip, you'll see a big surge in this number, excuse me. And it's not really reflecting anything meaningful about the economy. It's just a blip. So that, combined with the fact that the early numbers tend to be revised and can be revised pretty substantially, means that when you're looking at this number, I mean, I hesitate to say just ignore the first estimate, but I try my best to just ignore the first estimate. You know, that is the first number that gets released every month, the one that actually makes headlines. You know, unless I really need to know what is going on right now and I need every piece of information, I would rather just wait until we get a higher quality number once the Bureau has had time to incorporate all the best information. But in practice, what this really means is that you would just look at the 3-month average. So the average change in non-farm payroll employment over the last 3 months is going to be a much more reliable signal as to what's actually going on in the economy than just the latest number put out by the Bureau.
Alex, question from the audience. If you work multiple jobs, would you be counted multiple times?
So yes, in this survey, it's a count of the number of jobs, essentially, yes. So in that case, if you're working for 2 different businesses, you're going to show up as an employee of both of those businesses. All right, so the unemployment rate is the other component of the monthly jobs report, and this is the unemployment rate is there are many unemployment rates. Depending on who you include or what you count, but typically when somebody refers to the unemployment rate, they're talking about U3, which was mentioned earlier, and that's just the main unemployment rate that, for a variety of reasons, the Bureau has decided to highlight as sort of the central unemployment estimate. Okay, but what is unemployment? What does this actually mean? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines a person as unemployed if they are not working and available for work. And they also have to be either engaged in active job search or on temporary layoff. So this is a whole bunch of conditions. And in particular, that second bullet, the requirement of active job search or temporary layoff can get a little dicey. But what they're trying to get at here is how many people could work, would like to work, are available to work, and are not currently working. So this is just a really useful thing, a useful concept to have if you're a policymaker, is you want to know what is our available labor supply on the one hand, and that is another way of saying how many people are in a bad situation that is not what they want. They want to be working, they could be working, and it's not happening. So typically unemployment, it's a pretty unambiguous bad thing. Some amount is just going to happen naturally as people transition between jobs. It takes time to find a job, but the notion of unemployment is just a very useful concept compared with, say, just the number of people working, where you need context to interpret, is this a good number or a bad number? Generally, if we see someone who has become unemployed, or a lot of people becoming unemployed at once, that's always going to be a bad thing. Although I will caveat that in just a few minutes. So, okay, so, and the unemployment rate, what that is we count up all the number of people who are unemployed, who meet this definition, and then it's just that number of people as a share of the labor force. And the labor force is just all the unemployed, so people who could be working and want to work, plus the employed. So this is just how the unemployment rate is defined. And the population that is covered here is the civilian non-institutional population. So this does not include military personnel, it's civilian. It doesn't include people in institutions like prisons or long-term care facilities, but this is a very broad population. This is going to capture, unlike the non-farm payroll number, this will capture basically all of the people we think of as workers. So, and here is what the unemployment rate looks like. So one thing you will notice immediately is that we don't need to break off 2020 here. This is just one nice chart. You can see that what happened in the last couple of years was pretty wild, but it still fits on the same chart. And this, it seems silly, but this is a very useful thing because we have sort of, we have not entered some sort of new era here. The unemployment rate is still capturing what it was capturing before. It is successfully picking up the fact that what has just happened was extraordinary, was unusual, but it fits on the same chart, which if like me, you spend a lot of time looking at charts, this is great. This is really useful. You don't want to have to do that annoying thing where you make multiple charts for different periods. So much better for historical comparisons. Where's this coming from? So this is a totally separate survey from where the non-farm payroll employment number comes from. So non-farm payroll employment, that's coming from a survey of businesses. The unemployment rate is coming from a survey of households. So, you or I might get a call from or a letter from the Bureau of Labor Statistics saying we've been selected to participate in the current population survey. And this is also usually called the household survey. So every month, the Bureau, the Census Bureau goes out and finds 60,000 households. And altogether, the sample includes about 120,000 individuals. And that is about a 0.04% of the population that is trying to be represented by the survey. And that means that each person in the survey is representing about 2,500 people. So this is, a much smaller sample coverage than the survey of businesses that gives us the non-farm payroll employment number. Now, again, going from 0.04% to 100%, the way we do this is with survey weights. So just like with the businesses, we're going to take individuals, and they do this by state, age group, race, ethnicity, and gender. And basically, we're going to take people within each of those categories and assume that they are representative of everybody else who has those same set of characteristics. And by doing that, we're going to scale up the 0.04% that we've actually asked questions to and take them as representative of the full population. Now,
Alex, hang on. Yeah, real quick. Somebody's asking about how gig workers, specifically, Uber, are counted in the numbers.
So gig workers would definitely be picked up by this survey, because this survey is just going to go to an individual and ask them, did you work? Basically, did you work at all over the period that is, so I think they ask about last month, or no, they ask about the week of the month that contains the 12th day of the month. So basically, in this, a gig worker will be picked up. They will ask, did you work? And that person who understands themselves to be a worker, they will say yes. That person will not be picked up in the non-farm payroll employment number, because from the perspective of that survey, that is a self-employed person. They are not on anyone's payroll. So, no business, Uber does not have that person on payroll and to report to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So gig workers do not show up in the non-farm payroll employment number, but they will show up in the unemployment statistics. This same survey also produces estimates of employment, of just how many people are working, that are more comprehensive and will include gig workers.
Alex, another question is employment versus unemployment rates. Felt that one could get the employment from all the unemployment info out there. Is there somebody who compares these in sync? I don't know. Ron, do you want to ask your question? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? There you go.
Oh, hi guys. Just not the idea. Hey. It's great to see that. When I thought about these numbers, I always unemployment, some kind of, this is new for me, the employment rate. So I was wondering if somebody's comparing these two in sync, if that makes any sense.
Yes, so every month when the Bureau puts out their report, they pull a bunch of statistics from both of these surveys. So you can see, first, if we're just looking at the household survey, there's a measure of employment there, and you can figure out the share of the population that's employed from that. And then compare that directly with the unemployment statistics, which are always going to be consistent with those employment numbers because of just the way the survey is designed. The Bureau will also do regularly comparisons between the employment numbers from the household survey and employment numbers from the business survey or establishment survey that gives us the non-farm payroll employment number. And when you do adjustments to line up the household survey concepts, like take out the self-employed, when you try and line up the concepts across the two surveys, the two numbers do move very closely in sync, especially over the last decade. Yes, so we definitely can track both these numbers in both the unemployment and employment concepts together. Yes, hopefully.
If I could just, if I add a little bit, I think too, to sort of maybe where you're going with the question, I think one of the things that Alex is very good, which is why he's he recently has become associate director. The stuff is to take all of this information and get our sense of where those numbers is. So we're taking, unemployment numbers from here. We're taking these household surveys. We're combining all of this together to get our sense of where stuff is. And this is, I think, where Alex is showing this, where we're going to take all this information and kind of boil it down to a number that quote unquote we trust, we're comfortable with, those sorts of things.
Perfect. Just give me one number, one sheet, please.
Well, so, I think unfortunately we will come back to summarizing many statistics into one in the real-time measurement context. But I think, unfortunately, one of the takeaways I hope from this is that there is no perfect number. All of these numbers have upsides and downsides. And so, it really is sort of about looking at the full picture, all these different numbers. I mean, people talk about the data flow, use a term you often hear in terms of macro tracking. And that's because really, in order to understand what's going on in the economy, it's like, it is almost, I don't know, it really is like you just got to feel the flow of things to some extent, because there's so much information coming in, so many different moving parts, that even though the whole, the headline indicators, really the objective is to summarize everything in one, but it's just too difficult to task to really do in a way that I would have 100% confidence in. It's really about getting the full picture, unfortunately. Okay, so just very quickly, they are doing this survey of households. They got 120,000 people. They want to weight them up to the full population. One challenge that comes with this is, just like with the businesses who are going out of business or new businesses starting, we can't actually track the population year by year exactly. We do every 10 years. We do a decennial census, which gives us a very good count of the full population. But only at the beginning and end of each decade. So in between those censuses, the Bureau has to model the Census Bureau models the population. So basically they're doing a prediction of what the population will be, and then that is used as the target for weighting up the survey. Now, again, they're very good at this, but it's a very difficult task. So you will sometimes get the unemployment numbers affected by, if you're looking back over history, we can see that the numbers were somewhat affected by the fact that they messed up the population estimates a little bit, but it's not a huge issue. Usually, the unemployment numbers are fairly reliable, at least from the survey. The survey does not introduce much error.
Alex, another question from the audience is there any relevance of the Phillips curve in all of this?
So the unemployment rate would typically be one side of the, one of the variables that is being plotted on one of the axes in the Phillips curve. Generally, the Phillips curve is traditionally understood as a relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation. So there is huge relevance of this measurement to Phillips curve analysis, because any issues that affect the unemployment rate, any mismeasurement in the unemployment rate, that is going to affect your estimates of the Phillips curve. And if you're relying on a Phillips curve, that will affect your predictions for inflation. So unemployment measurement, very, very critical for Phillips curves. Now, you can construct a Phillips curve using a different measure of, where the economy is at, because really what we're saying is that if the economy is close to its capacity, we would expect to see inflation rise. So, if unemployment is very low, there's not a lot of underutilized workers lying around. In that case, we might expect to see inflation go up, just because there's pressure from demand being high relative to supply. So yes, so all that, the unemployment measurement is central to it, and people have done a lot of work trying to get away from using the unemployment rate for Phillips curve analysis, largely because of things we're going to talk about right now, conveniently. So
and then
going
one more
back
question. Sorry, Alex, one more question. So from Evan, it seems that the past 20 years have been more volatile than the previous 50. Do you incorporate increasing volatility into your forecasting models?
So not as like a hard, I mean, the short answer is no. Not as like we don't assume that there's going to be any continuing trend in the volatility of the labor market. And I think this is actually it's difficult to assess how and when whether things have gotten more volatile and over what period. We typically think of the period through the early 80s was very volatile, and then things stabilized for about 20, 30 years, depending on who you ask. And then sometimes that period gets referred to as the Great Moderation, because basically inflation became more stable, unemployment seemed to be more stable. And that sort of held up until 2006, 2007, when the financial crisis came along. And since then, the combination of very large unemployment during the financial crisis and the slow recovery following that, and then of course 2020, now volatility is off the charts. Things look crazy in historical perspective, but we don't expect that. I guess in our projections, we don't incorporate recurring world historic crises, given that they seem to be happening every decade now, or we have 2 data points. Maybe we should be, but so far, basically, we continue to just model that the labor market will operate the way that we think it should, in the absence of, say, a global pandemic.
Yeah, I think part of so Alex is right. We don't strictly incorporate it, and I think we will miss kind of big turns. So if we have a projection that's going up and then it takes a sharp drop, we're going to miss that first drop. We don't, because again, we don't predict that there's going to be a pandemic, say in 2040. And so we're going to miss those sorts of things. Similarly, if there was a huge jump up, we would miss that as well. Again, our forecasting models don't strictly build in that, like, okay, now we should have a real big change one direction or another.
Okay, so some issues with the definition of unemployment that I showed you earlier. So active job search, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics means by that is stuff like, did you apply for a job? Did you contact employers to inquire about a job? Basically, did you take steps to show that you are interested in working, you are actually, and you are actively engaging with that interest? But this is ultimately pretty arbitrary and can, lead the difference between someone being unemployed because they're looking for work versus not in the labor force because they're considered to be not looking for work can basically be, did you have time to actually pick up the phone that week? And this can get into things like, personality in theory. How bold are you in calling up employers to ask about a job that maybe you're not qualified for? Stuff like that can affect whether someone is classified as unemployed or not in the labor force. And so that's not great. There's just no hard and fast way to identify who is really available for work and looking for work. These categories are just kind of blurry. And one of the ways that shows up in the data is that if you look at who is getting a job, where are they coming from, a larger share of the people getting a job in a normal month are going to be people who are not in the labor force previous month. Now, that could be people who are in college and now are entering the labor market, but a lot of it is just people who were not recorded in the survey as having worked, even though I think, if you talked to them, if you looked at their life and what they're doing, we would probably say this is a person who is not working, available for work, and is looking for work. They just didn't happen to actually click the link or something, or they filled out the application and never submitted it. So if we're looking at a dramatic increase in the number of people counted as unemployed, we know something is going on. But if you're just looking at very small changes in the number of unemployed, it's sort of hard. You don't want to draw too much from that because these categories again are just a little blurry. And we see in the data that the number of someone being unemployed is not necessarily going to be the strongest predictor that they are going to be getting a job anytime soon. Another issue with this is that it's binary. So we are not capturing someone who, say, wants to be working full-time and is only able to get part-time work. Even if they're looking for a full-time job, they're just going to be counted as employed. Now, the Bureau has other measures of unemployment. So this would be, when we say U3, that's one of several measures. U6, for instance, is much more comprehensive, and that will capture how many people are underemployed. But we typically just focus on this headline number of who has a job versus who doesn't. And then final issue, which normally is not something we would talk about, but because it became very relevant during the pandemic, I'm going to spend a minute or two on it, which is that part of the definition is that you are engaged in active job search or you are on temporary layoff. And what temporary layoff means is you are not working, but basically your employer has told you that, please stop working now, but you will be coming back to work. You have a definite point in time at which you will be returning to work. So the reason this became an issue early on in the pandemic is that a lot of people who were furloughed, they did not, the survey, it was such an unusual circumstance in March and April of 2020 that the way that the survey asked about this stuff didn't really line up with how people were thinking about it. So a lot of people, the business they worked at closed, but we expected that eventually the pandemic would end, these businesses would reopen, and we would come back to work. So those people really should have been classified as on temporary layoff because they expected to go back to work within a year. But what ended up happening is it was the pandemic. So when someone asks you, why aren't you at work? You might say something like, well, it's for health reasons. And in those cases, somebody who is not at work for health reasons would be counted like somebody who is taking sick leave on the day of the survey. And so we don't want to consider those people unemployed. So because of this confusion about, am I on temporary layoff? Am I just not working for some other reason? There was quite a bit of misclassification of people who should have been unemployed were counted as still employed. So this is not a big issue, especially going forward. The Bureau has adjusted how it does the survey to try and account for this. But it's just another thing to keep in mind. Sort of these categories are not hard and fast, and you need to be a little cautious when you're looking at numbers, especially when you're in a crisis and things are unprecedented. So putting all this together, what seems like a simple question: if the unemployment rate goes down, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think the obvious answer, to me at least, is that that's good. If normally what we think is the unemployment rate goes down because someone who is unemployed found a job and started working. So now they have moved from unemployment to employment, and that we think is good. But the unemployment rate can also go down because the number of people who are actually trying to find a job has gone down. If people get discouraged and give up on looking for work, now they are no longer part of the unemployed because they stopped engaging in active job search. They're still not working, they're still available for work, but they are not going to be counted as unemployed. And this has been an issue recently. So just a little quote from the Wall Street Journal for the January employment rate. This became quite a significant factor then. There was a big drop in the unemployment rate, but a lot of it was sort of the bad kind of drop where people gave up on going back to work and stopped doing active job search. So challenges of interpretation again. Okay. So summarizing everything, unemployment and the unemployment rate are just very, very useful concepts for policymakers because they tell us what is the available labor supply, and it's pretty easy to know, is this a good unemployment rate? Is this a bad unemployment rate? So this is what I mean here by straightforward interpretation of level. If you ever see that the unemployment rate is 10% or something, things are going very, very badly. If the unemployment rate is 3%, things are going very well. And this is true, across US history. It's true cross-nationally, usually, that unemployment rates tend to be fairly similar across countries. So there's, it's a useful concept and it's really easy to interpret the level, at least at the extremes. A couple other good, advantages of the unemployment rate. If you remember from the chart, it's not very noisy. It doesn't bounce around a lot. And then also there are revisions and there is seasonal adjustment, but these are just tiny compared with the non-farm payroll employment numbers. So the number you get, you can be pretty sure that when you see an unemployment rate reported for, say, when we see an unemployment rate reported for April tomorrow, we can be pretty confident that 1 year from now, we're still going to think that that's what the unemployment rate was in April of 2021. And that's just not true with the payroll employment number. The challenge here, of course, is that it's just it is sort of an inherently ambiguous concept of who is available for work, who is engaged in active job search. No hard and fast distinctions. Survey questioning can matter a lot. There's just a lot of issues around this, as we discussed. And then finally, that because the unemployment rate can rise or fall just because of people giving up for work, usually we understand that unemployment rate going down is good, but that is not necessarily going to be the case. So again, relying on one number, unfortunately, is not gonna give you everything you need to know, and you sort of need to look at why did the unemployment rate fall? Is it because people got jobs, or is it because people gave up on getting jobs? All right, so you may have been wondering why I started off showing you this from December and not the latest number. That's just to set up this neat little comparison where if we look at the latest report on the jobs number, the Wall Street Journal has changed how they specify these things. And usually the language here is pretty standard, but it has sort of evolved gradually over the last few months to include a reference to the fact that we're talking about seasonally adjusted non-farm payroll employment. And then also to highlight that the unemployment rate and the payroll employment numbers come from separate surveys. So I just thought that was interesting. Hopefully now when you see the current phrasing, you will know exactly what they mean by that. Yes. Okay. Any questions before I move on to section 2? No, okay. So far we've been talking about the monthly employment report. So this is, we get one number for each month, and that number comes out a week after the end of the month. Now, that's pretty good. Monthly is a fairly regular check-in on the economy. A week after the end of the month is not that long to wait. Again, unless you happen to be in the midst of an all-time historical crisis, in which case, policymaking, the data we get is at best really monthly. Policymaking is day to day, is sometimes hour to hour. And as we really discovered in 2020, we just don't have time to wait for the high quality and comprehensive, but somewhat lagging information that we get from the headline indicators. So that is where real-time tracking of the economy comes in. So real-time tracking has always sort of been a dream of people who follow the economy. And it was sort of a pipe dream because the information just wasn't available. Where would it come from? We didn't really, we knew the data was out there, but getting it all into one place and making it available to researchers, it just never seemed like that would happen. 2020 really just shook things up in a big way, and private entities, corporations, other research organizations just sort of opened up in an unprecedented way, made a ton of information available to researchers, to policymakers, and to the general public. So mostly the kind of information that we've gotten that someone like me would not have had access to before 2020. We have a lot of information from mobile devices. So this is, companies are collecting information from different apps and then assembling it and making it available to researchers or just to the public. A lot of enterprise services. So, maybe you're a company that has software that creates software to help businesses track hours worked of their employees or employee scheduling software. A lot of them have made information available from the data that they're collecting. Of course, all of this is anonymized, even when you have to go through a whole process to get access to it. They're not telling us anything about which businesses, so this is all anonymized. And then all kinds of other information, payroll processors, card transactions, And this is just incredible information because we get usually a data point for every day, which is very, very useful. We're getting it with a lot of geographic detail. So often we're getting information down to the county, sometimes the zip code level. So if you want to figure out what's going on in any particular place, not only can you do it in effectively real time, there's maybe a few days, sometimes a week or two lag before we get the data. But this is now possible in a way that, normally if you wanted information on the labor market in a particular county, you might have to wait a year or two, at least before the Bureau of Labor Statistics would get enough quality information that for something as small as a single county, they would put out a number that they would feel confident in. So this really, this for people like me, this has really been a revolution in what is available and how much we can keep an eye on what is going on in the economy from day to day. And this has spawned, a proliferation of these trackers, which we are partly responsible for. We've made our own contribution to this, but there's a lot of really good info out there that is available basically in real time to the public. And even more information is available to researchers. So here are just some examples of the kind of stuff that's out there. Now, there are some drawbacks to this data. There is a reason that the Bureau of Labor Statistics takes all this time and invests all these resources in putting together these numbers, which is what they want is high reliability, comprehensive numbers. The real-time data that we are getting from mostly private sources is certainly not comprehensive, and the quality is often highly suspect. And it's not to say that they're doing anything bad, it's just they're collecting what they see, and they're giving us one little piece of the puzzle, but that one little piece is not giving us as good a picture as, say, the official releases. So, if we're thinking about something like the mobile device location data that we get, usually what we're seeing is one of these companies is collecting information from some set of apps. We don't know what, but we don't know who these users are. Are they representative of the full population? Probably not. And so, we don't actually know whether we're getting really who exactly it is we're looking at. And then also, they are not really, because these are mostly private companies, they're collecting this data for their own ends. They're not doing a lot of work to make sure that, the samples they get are statistically sound or consistent over time, which is fine. But it just means that, these things have to be used with caution. Second, if you do want to use data for something like a county, remember, this is daily data. For something that small, it's just very unlikely that you're going to have a big enough set of people providing information to get a steady sort of consistent signal. So a lot of the data we get is very, very noisy at the county level or lower. And then finally is just, if we're interested in something like the total employment in the economy, no company is measuring that. No company has that information. That's why the Bureau of Labor Statistics does all its surveys. So what we get are many little pictures, many little pieces of the picture that are all imperfect proxies for the thing that we actually ultimately care about. So now going to talk about what we do with all that information, because this is work that we developed as part of our policy analysis on COVID and the policy response to COVID, where especially in 2020, but still to this day, it's just very important to know what is going on day to day. We have a lot of information, but it's not necessarily the best information. And so what we want to do is try and take what we have and put it all together, take all these little pieces of the picture and combine them into something like one number that we can use, and that ideally we can use to proxy for like the official employment statistics, which is ultimately a concept, that's the concept we understand, that's the terms we think in. So what we would like to do is take all these little pieces of information we have and put them together into something like the official employment numbers, but that is real time, that is available daily, and that has much more geographic detail than what we get from those employment reports. So I'm going to focus on the example of employment, since that's what we've been talking about so far. So some examples of the indicators that we actually have for this that we're getting from these companies. First, like I said, we have a lot of information from enterprise software and payroll service providers. So this gives us information on, how many hours of employee time are businesses reporting to the apps that they're using to manage that stuff. Employees, how much are they actually reporting in earnings? We can use that to infer how many people are working. We have information from mobile devices on how much time are people spending at places that look like it's a workplace. So obviously, if you're just looking at somebody's, where somebody is over time, you don't know for sure that this place is a workplace versus that place is home. But if what we see is, someone is in this location at night for 8 hours every day, and then every morning they go to this location for 8 hours and they come back, we can infer from that this is home, that's the workplace, and then we can see how many people are going to workplaces over time. And then another source of information we use that has proved surprisingly useful is web searches. From basically Google searches. Google very generously lets the public see what people are searching in different places, or some at least provides some information about it. And we have found, and others have found, that if you look at searches for things like unemployment insurance, so people are Googling because they lost their job and they want to file an unemployment claim. If you look at that, you can get a pretty good prediction of what will the ultimate unemployment insurance numbers look like when we get the official numbers. Another example is hiring forms. So there's a set of forms that you have to complete if you're going to hire somebody, and Google searches for how to fill out those forms basically are a pretty decent leading indicator of new hiring. So those are some examples of the kind of things we're using to measure employment. And here is just, I've just plotted a few of these, the ones that basically you can sort of make a comparison on. There are many more indicators, but here are a few examples for Philadelphia of basically just different measures of employment that we are using. And so what you can see here is clearly there's a common pattern across all these different metrics, that things got very, very bad in early 2020 and have been gradually coming back since. But there's also a lot of differences between these different numbers. They are each giving us some information, but not necessarily all sending the same signal every day. So what do we do with these to actually pull out of this what's going on with the underlying employment that we care about? So our approach is we construct a real-time employment tracker using a method called principal components analysis. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but please let me know if you want me to stop and talk more about any step. What we do basically is first we normalize all the indicators relative to a pre-pandemic normal, which is a difficult thing to do, but basically what we're trying to do here is something like the seasonal adjustment that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does. We're saying, every day, there are more people going to work on a Friday than there are on a Sunday. That's just normal. So we don't want to, interpret that as something bad going on with the economy. So we're trying to sort of normalize everything to get, a measure of the difference from normalcy. And then what we do is we take the first principal component of all of these normalized indicators, which I'll explain a little more what that means. And then we're going to scale that in terms of the same units as the official monthly employment numbers, which is millions of people working, basically. So principal components is a very nice some statistical technique. And it's nice because it's pretty simple. If you know a little bit of linear algebra, you can probably understand what is happening here. It's doing something fairly straightforward. It's a dimensionality reduction method, meaning we have many pieces of information, and what we're trying to do is shrink that down to one piece of information that hopefully captures everything we care about across those different indicators. So really what the first principal component, what we're using here, it's a weighted average of all of our different indicators where the weights are constructed so as to maximize the amount of information that we are that is contained in this new series that we're creating. So we have many time series. We're going to collapse them all down to one single time series that captures a little bit of information from all of the different individual indicators. And what we're trying to do there is extract the latent signal. So, there is some common thing called employment, and that is what's driving all of these indicators. And we are trying to recover that from, these things that ultimately are consequences of this underlying employment. So,
Alex,
oh, yeah.
Question from the audience. What % of variability is typically captured by first principle component?
So that varies a lot across the, so we are doing this at the county level. So it varies a lot depending on the I guess there is no, unfortunately, there is no simple answer to this. I mean, it could be, if you plug in a bunch of series that turn out to be uncorrelated, you're not going to capture any variation. So it's really, really context dependent here. And because we are constructing this at the county level, so it's a different index for each county, there are some counties where this works really, really well, where, the information that we have is doing a great job representing the market, representing the labor market there. And so we will capture a lot of the variation in the underlying series there. Other counties, if it's, say, a very rural county, maybe there aren't that many people with mobile devices there just because there aren't that many people there. There, we might not capture much of the variation at all. And really just because we have no information there. But so one nice thing about, in addition to the idea that this should be pulling out a latent signal, because of that, the principal components approach also handles a lot of the problems we have with noise, or the fact that, we might be getting one measure of time spent at work from, one sample of mobile devices, and then a different measure of time spent at work from a different sample of mobile devices. Those samples could have, idiosyncrasies, but this principal components filtering mechanism will essentially, hopefully, get rid of all that stuff and leave us with just a nice, clean underlying signal. And then, because obviously the economy of any given location is going to depend a lot on specific circumstances, it might be that information on people working at at retail stores is very important for an urban county, and not very important for a more rural county. Whereas information on how much people are moving around, are people going to, say, a manufacturing facility that might be in the suburbs or something, we can, because we are doing this separately for each county, each indicator can have a different level of importance in each county, depending on how much of the other indicators it co-moves with. So basically, we're constructing a county-specific measure that does not really impose much restriction on which indicators are most important. That can be very, very flexible. So once we have extracted that common signal, hopefully, this gives us a unitless daily measure. So it's sort of hard to interpret. You can see it goes up, it goes down, but it's hard to interpret how much it's going up, how much it's going down over time. So what we do is we rescale it. We linearly rescale it into the same units as the official monthly employment number. So this is really for interpretability. It doesn't change the shape. It doesn't change how things move over time. It just sort of, shifts a line up or down and maybe stretches it or compresses it so that it is in terms of the same, it has basically the same underlying statistical distribution as the employment number that we ultimately care about. And here is the result of that for employment, which I will admit is the one that works best. So it's fortunate that we're talking about employment, because I'll talk a little about some other examples where it works, but not as cleanly as this. So what we see here is, what we're looking at here is, we've constructed these county level employment indexes, and then we are aggregating them up to the US total. And then we are plotting it against the official monthly statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the total US. So that's those red squares. And I mean, I'll admit this works a lot better than I thought it would when we started this work. And I don't show this here, but you can do this at the county level. You can look at changes month to month at the county level, and it still does a very, very good job of tracking it. So, I was pretty impressed with how this came out, and it has proved to be really useful. It has held up over time. We are continuously updating how we do the inputs to this. And even as we have seen a total collapse of the labor market and then a pretty sharp recovery, these indicators, none of which are especially good on their own, once you put them together, pull out the common signal, they actually do a very good job of explaining what is going on in the labor market. And just, we've also done this for basically used the same approach for a couple of other applications, like measuring social distancing. One of the big reasons people started putting out all this data was to keep track of social distancing. But again, many pieces of information that are each of themselves imperfect. And so what we do is often just put them together and pull out the common social distancing signal. And then a similar thing for GDP here, basically we'll just pull any piece of information about a local economy that we can find, throw it in to the index, and do the same basic thing where we try and scale into the official GDP measures. This one is a lot harder to do just because GDP is a much less straightforward concept and has many, many more moving pieces. So it's a lot harder to track with the information that we have. But it still works reasonably well. And all right, I think that's where I will turn it back to Rich.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Alex. So obviously, Alex has gone through these examples of data that we're using, that's publicly available. But I kind of want to talk about, so now we have these data, and how we use that to forecast tax changes. So I kind of want to start with a pretty simple explanation of a couple terms here that you'll hear sometimes in our estimates. So Alex, can you flip forward one slide? Okay, so I don't think you're going to hear wicked static very often, but that's sort of internally what we call an estimate, basically that is just taking the same base and applying a new tax rate. So I'll go through a simple example in a second. But if you think about recent proposals with Biden, it's basically just saying, okay, there's a set of people that are currently paying 37% tax rate on their income, and that's now going to change to 40%. That change, if you just apply that new rate, would be what we would call internally wicked static. So the base stays the same. When we present revenue estimates, they're typically conventional revenue estimates. And again, this is a nomenclature that we've adopted to make it clear. This is going to include some behavioral response. So again, simple example, that income tax rate changes. People are going to do things to hide some of that income, adjust working amounts to reduce that tax rate. That's going to change that base, and you'll get a different number than a strict, again, wicked static number. So the last piece is dynamic, which again is kind of related to some of the stuff Alex is saying, but it takes these behavioral responses, takes the new revenue and puts it into a larger model that then will predict, okay, GDP should go up or down based on this. Labor participation should change, capital investment should change, things like that. Sorry, Alex, there's one question I just want to kind of address that you can answer about the working from home, how that handled in sort of the daily data that you've looked at.
Yes, so this is definitely capturing people who are working from home. It's definitely one of the challenges that we face, just because it's hard to pick that up in a lot of the sources we have. So for instance, I referred to the time spent at work. Obviously, that is not going to capture people who have not lost their jobs, but have just started working from home. But there are a few reasons, I think, and this was something that we spent a fair amount of time investigating, specifically because we produce these estimates, we're looking at them and like, why does this work so well, even though we're not capturing these people? And so we spent some time looking into it. And so I think there are a few things going on here. First off is that most of the change in employment obviously has not been among people who are working from home. So when we're looking at, why is employment in a county so much lower, in June than it was in January of 2020, it's mostly because of people who would be going to work and now are not. So, in terms of the change, the people who are working from home, they don't really matter for capturing a change in employment. Second, some of our measures do actually capture this, especially stuff like the web searches. The payroll processing data is fairly comprehensive. I mean, it's not covering the whole economy, but it certainly covers a lot of businesses who are not just retailers. But so we do have some direct information on it. But it definitely is the case that we have much better information about workers who who are in traditional, you have to be there industries like retail and leisure services and that sort of thing. So there's a big concern, and maybe that will become an issue going forward as the economy shifts in this recovery. But so far, it just hasn't really hampered our ability to track employment pretty well at the county level.
Okay, and there's another question sort of about the how good the correlations hold for pre-pandemic. So I think it's the principal components analysis, like how does it change if the underlying signal is not that strong or changes, I think. So yeah, I think the way I interpret the question, and maybe Alberto, you can clarify if you want, is along the lines of you have these different pieces. If the signal that they have in common is weak, what would be the consequence?
Yes. So unfortunately, and this is sort of the one of the really big challenges we faced dealing with this, is that almost all of the data that we have is only available starting at the beginning of 2020, and that's just because that is when these companies started making it available. So this has been the continued. This is why we've relied so much on county level variation rather than variation over time as sort of our main validation approach. Because yes, unfortunately, we cannot construct these measures for 2019 or 2018. We just don't have the data available. We have a few bits and pieces, and we've constructed sort of super stripped down versions of the employment index for earlier years, and it does fine, but it's missing the vast majority of the information that we use. And I'll be honest, actually, I don't even remember we did that, and if it had been terrible, I think probably I would remember. I mean, we would have done something different, but I looked at it as like, it's fine. We're going to rely on the cross-county differences rather than pre-pandemic benchmarking. Although I would love to have the information to be able to do that, and not just for benchmarking. Having that more historical data would make our measures much more reliable going forward. But they're just not giving us the data to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Alberto. So Alex, if you just want to jump forward one slide. So here's a sort of a concrete, simple example of just the difference here. If you look at the blue lines first, these are what we call static gallons or wicked static gallons, and just over time, what's that projection? So if you have a change in, and I think the way I drew this up was a change in the gasoline tax of $1. So right now it's about 20 cents. If you increase it to $1.20, what would happen? And so in a static sense, we would just be looking at the blue lines. So the blue gallons, and then the blue dotted line, solid line, and then the blue dotted line is the revenue. So that again is like nobody's changing their behavior. I'm driving just as much. So the gallon projection stays the same. The red lines capture this behavioral response. So if there's a tax change that's proposed, say in starting 2020, that red line will be below the blue line because more people are going to take public transportation, ride bikes, work from home, those sorts of things. That's a behavioral response, and then we'd have less revenue. So, and again, in all the things we do, we try to account for these things. So we have these projections, and any policy change that we see should change those projections if we think they have an effect on people's behavior. Some proposals are small enough that they don't change people's behavior. Something we've done is we've looked at a value-added tax. A large value-added tax of 10% or 15% on every purchase would affect what people do and change the way they're buying patterns. If the rate on a value-added tax is 1% or 1.5%, we don't expect that people would change their behavior. And so these are things where we're looking at what we see and we adjust those projections based on those things. So if you jump forward, Alex, how are they changing these things? There's a couple of things they can do. So they can change when their income is realized. So in capital gains example, which again, the Biden administration has proposed this increase in tax on capital gains, we'd expect people to just not sell their stocks till later, right? They're just going to hold on later, maybe in hopes that the rate will come down. So there's this intertemporal shift of income. So capital gains, I can move forward. The base shift is another one, which I will go in a little bit more deeply here in another slide. Is in businesses, we have a choice of how you're taxed. You can be taxed as a corporation or what's called a pass-through. And so if you start changing the corporate rate, we should see businesses change to their type of entity, and that would change the base that's in the corporate rate, and that would reduce revenue that we would expect to gain from a change in the corporate tax. And then there's this flavor shift. Certain types of income can actually change. You can change whether it's labor or capital, and if it's labor, it faces employment taxes. If it's capital, it faces capital gains rates. Those are very, very different rates, and some individuals are able to take advantage of that. And then there's this combination of all of those things. So yeah, Alex, you want to just jump forward? So just because we're running a little short on time, here's sort of our explanation of what would go into a choice of entity type, which I can circle back to, but I just kind of want to jump forward to a little bit. If you go keep one more slide. So here's yeah, this one, perfect. So here's what we're thinking about when we think about a choice of entity. So I'm a business, I can be a C corporation, I can be a pass-through, a partnership, S corp, or a sole prop, but I'm going to face different taxes. And we think those business owners are going to make that decision based on a tax wedge. So what we do is we calculate the difference between what they would face as a corporation versus what they would face as a pass-through, and then we calculate what businesses should change based on that. We use an elasticity that we've estimated from data. So you want to jump forward, Alex? So ultimately, this is the story, and I'll this will be our last slide because it'll leave at least a couple minutes for questions, have stuff. But if you look at sort of the red numbers there, that's the difference in this tax wedge. And so this is the incentive. So businesses going from C corporation to pass through in 2017, before the big tax bill, there was a tax advantage to be a pass through. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act changed how corporations were taxed. It lowered the tax rate. So you'd expect there to be less corporations. That's reflected in that -1 red number. That suggested that there should be more corporations than pass-throughs. And so as we account for that, then the revenue raised under these taxes would change. And then, for political reasons, that last column, that red 6.4, was added because the pass-through people said, hey, you've lowered the corporate rate. We don't think that's fair. You should also lower the pass-through rate. And they wanted their 7.1 percentage point advantage, and what they settled for was 6.4% percentage point advantage. So again, in this political process, we work with lawmakers, we show them these sorts of things. They listen to pass-through lobbyists say, hey, we're now at a disadvantage. And then they put in something which is called the pass-through deduction to make those rates a little bit closer to what they were before. And from our perspective, I think Alex would agree with me here, the difference there should just be 0. So it shouldn't be 7.1 or 6.4 or -1. It should just be 0. All businesses should face the same taxes. But that's a we try to be nonpartisan, so we don't want to push too much on that. But I think tax economists in general would think that businesses should be taxed the same across the board. So I'll stop there because we just have a couple minutes left. I know we kind of sped through this last piece, but I want to give you a chance to ask any questions about how we incorporate some of the data that Alex has presented beyond what he's done, and or any specific questions about policy experiments that we've done.
Thank you so much for this presentation. In incorporating some of the more recent data, how do you conduct like overlap analysis, and what are some high-level things that you do to make sure, like, the data that you're capturing from Google search, for example, doesn't overlap with data available elsewhere?
Alex, you want to take that one?
Sure. So sorry, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by overlap.
As in, in the past, when you conducted surveys, it was somewhat messy, by design. But with the new data sources, it doesn't have to be messy. So you'll have to account for some level of overlap between the data, some level of like gap in the new data, that there's some segments, some geographies, some people who are not covered if you use only the new data set.
Yes. So if I'm understanding the question right, I mean, we sort of are, we're looking for that overlap between the different pieces of information that we have.
Yeah, I think if I could jump in a little bit too, I think if I understand correctly, so we don't, the new data sources and the more real-time data, that doesn't completely replace all of the other data that we get, say monthly, or we look at as a 3-month average. I think we're always taking all of it and trying to make sure it matches. And as I think Alex was trying to point out before, is that, a lot of that real-time data for us is a leading indicator. So if we need to do something with a little more time sensitivity, we rely on that. But then we verify that later on as we can line up that real-time data that maybe happens within the month with the number that we get once a month. And so for us, we're always using more and more data. And so we wouldn't ever completely just rely on one source or another.
Got it. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I have another question.
Sure.
How do you blend the old and the new, as in the velocity and variability of the new data sources coming in can be high? So what are some challenges you have seen there to just reconcile all that data, and how are you going about it in a more scalable way?
Yes. Yeah, so the challenge is exactly what you're saying, because it's so high, it's volatile and it's coming in at such a pace. That's the first difficulty. Yeah. But yeah, Alex, you want to?
Well, yeah. So this really, to my mind, is the big thing we get from this principal components approach, is that it is very, very good at taking many pieces of information that might be even telling a different story, and it can sort of sort out, or it can at least give us a first impression of whether there is a common story across all of these different pieces that we're getting. Or if there's no story, then we're just not getting any signal. But the really here we are relying on this just pure statistical technique. I mean, really what we're doing is averaging all of these indicators. We're just doing a weighted average where the weights, we're letting the data decide what the weights on any indicator should be. Yeah, and so and the way that I think about it is really what we're trying to create is, suppose you wanted to predict all of these different pieces of information that we have. You wanted one series that would do the best job of predicting all of those different pieces of information, and that's what the first principle component is really giving us there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think, Lauren, we're out of time, so I'll just say thank you from both Alex and I. We appreciate the opportunity to share stuff, and we're always happy to talk about this stuff. So if anybody wants to reach out, I think we'd be happy to discuss it.
Great. Well, thank you both. So if anybody wants to learn more about Penn Wharton budget model, Jillian did put a link to the website in the chat, and you can reach out to Alex and Rich. Thank you both so much for this engaging session. Just a reminder that this afternoon at 3, we have the Teradata workshop, so hope to see you all there. And then you can also check out the on-demand content tab on the events portal. All of the sessions from earlier this week can be found there. We also have additional content from our research centers, and this workshop will be there tomorrow morning as well. So if you want a refresher and dig in, you can do that. And thanks for your time, and see you this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.